Welcome to today's session on Digital Exclusion in Focus, Insights from Audit Scotland's 2024 report. My name is Elizabeth Anderson. I am the Chief Executive here at the Digital Poverty Alliance, and I'm delighted that we are joined by David Love, Bernadette Milligan and Gillian Matthew, who are going to talk us through a little bit about the report and some of the key insights that really brings into focus. If you are not familiar with the work of the Digital Poverty Alliance, we are an independent charity. We work across the whole of the UK, bringing together organisations, whether they're governmental, business, charitable, educational, health, the list goes on, with that shared focus of ending digital poverty once and for all by the end of the decade. It would be great, David, Bernadette and Gillian, if you could just very briefly introduce yourself to our audience today.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Will I go first? So, hi everybody, I'm David Love. I'm a senior auditor with Audit Scotland, and most recently I was involved in working with the team on their digital exclusion report. Delighted to have the opportunity to talk through the key findings today with you. Nice to see everybody.
Happy to go next. So I'm Bernadette Milligan, Audit Manager with Audit Scotland, and was the Audit Manager for this particular report on digital exclusion. So excited to speak to the Digital Poverty Alliance today, to Elizabeth. Obviously been following your work throughout the audit and made use of many resources that you have.
Hi, and I'm Gillian Matthew, Senior Manager at Audit Scotland, and was working with a team on the audit. I'm quite involved in a lot of our work that's related to equalities and human rights, so this one was very relevant to that. So yeah, just looking forward to letting everybody know a bit more about the report. Thanks.
Wonderful, and we're so grateful for you giving up your time to share a little bit with us today. To really set the scene for everyone tuning in today, David, could you give us a little bit of an overview of the report and some of the key insights and context that have come through?
Certainly, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so just to set the scene, we published our audit report on tackling digital exclusion back in August this year. The audit was a joint audit carried out on behalf of the Auditor General for Scotland and the Accounts Commission. And the overall aim of the audit was to consider how well public bodies in Scotland understand and are tackling digital exclusion. The audit took a slightly different approach to our traditional audit angle, in that we took a human rights-based approach with this one, and that involved involving people with lived experience of digital exclusion, getting their direct participation in the audit and in the way we shaped our messages. And the audit scope also included considering how human rights were being affected by digital exclusion. So I suppose in terms of the overall theme, in terms of impact, we've highlighted in the report that digital exclusion can have a severe impact on people's lives and on their social and economic well-being. We have a number of key messages in the report, but overall we could probably summarise these as saying that when it's used well, digital technology can improve public services to better meet people's needs. And we can see it can provide opportunities for significant efficiencies and improved accessibility and help public services remain affordable. But online public services don't always consider the needs of people without digital access, and that can put their rights at risk. We do highlight in the report as well that digitalisation is a key element of public service reform. So it's important that all public bodies take the responsibility for enabling digital exclusion in their programmes for reform. We'll make a number of recommendations for improvement in the report, and we'll possibly come on to talk about those in more detail. But as a performance audit, we did look at the whole range of public bodies in Scotland. So that included Scottish Government, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities as the umbrella body for councils individually, and public bodies across the country. As well as making recommendations, we also aim to support improvement across the public sector in enabling digital inclusion. And we include in part 3 of our report a set of principles for enabling digital inclusion, covering why it's important to enable it, how to enable digital inclusion, and importantly, what needs to be put in place by public bodies. And we support that by highlighting some practical steps that public bodies need to take to enable digital inclusion, together with case studies that illustrate those principles in practice. Alongside the report, we published a self-assessment checklist for public bodies, their boards and council elected members. And that contains a set of questions that public bodies can ask themselves in scrutinising their own progress. And we're hopeful that will help them make improvements in developing inclusive digital services. So a quick summary of some of the key messages, which I'm sure we'll tease out through our discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, David. And yeah, a huge amount is packed into this report. So I would certainly urge everyone to make sure that you download a copy of it and really start to think about actually what this might mean for the services that you're operating, and what lessons can be learned from different parts of the country and indeed different parts of the world, from some of the findings that the Audit Scotland team have really teased out here. Gillian, you sort of said in your intro that a lot of your work focuses around equalities and therefore the inclusion that sits with that. And the report really does highlight the severe impact that digital inclusion has on people's lives, particularly those of vulnerable people. How can public services really ensure that they're meeting the needs of those who are most affected by digital exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think, David's already alluded to, but really important to highlight that there are obviously benefits to digital technology. So we're not saying, it's all bad. It can bring benefits to people and communities, and if done well, it can actually improve access. And then, as we say, bring efficiencies to public services, which is really important at the moment as resources are being tightened. However, digital exclusion is really strongly linked to poverty. And it does tend to be the people who rely on most of public services that are at risk of digital exclusion, because they can't afford a digital advice or internet connection, or they have a lack of digital skills. So it's really essential that all public bodies are aware of the impact of digital exclusion and really to make an effort to understand the needs of people using their services, and then therefore put in place appropriate support as well. And this really needs to be built into the design of any new services right at the beginning. It can't be an afterthought, because that's often where, it's not picked up that there may be issues for people accessing services. And there are, already quite a lot of tools and resources available that we sort of set out in the report as well, but they're not being used consistently. I think we'll get into a bit more detail about some of these in a bit, but a key tool that a lot of people will be aware of is a quality impact assessment, and these should really be carried out, again, right at the beginning, not as an afterthought. And this can help identify potential barriers to access for different groups of people, and then also sort of identify some of the support that might be needed. The SCVO, which is the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, published a digital roadmap for Scotland, and this sets out actions to help help public services make meaningful progress. And as David mentioned, we've also got a set of principles which we developed, and it was really bringing together, kind of all the sort of key findings, and some of the things that we saw as the sort of main ways that people can actually enable digital inclusion. And then the checklist as well that David mentioned, that really has hopefully really helpful questions for public bodies, board members and elected members as well. So that will allow them to scrutinise the progress they're already making, how are they doing at the moment around enabling digital inclusion, and then to make, identify where the gaps are, and then make improvements to develop inclusive digital services from there. And there's, then there's links to sort of good practice tools, examples under, each of the issues as well. So just trying to make it as practical as possible for public bodies to improve things.
And it feels like that's such a great way of making sure that digital inclusion is really built into that equality impact assessment. There's obviously so many factors that need to be taken into consideration. But if you're creating digital services or if you're moving a service online, that's so fundamental. And I mean, in that increasingly digital world, and let's remember Scotland really are arguably leading the way in a lot of the digital inclusion work that we're seeing in the UK. But access to the internet, access to those digital devices, that's absolutely vital. And the report pulls out that around 14% of Scotland's population can't afford what you've described as sufficient access. And significant inequalities in internet access are noted across income levels. So 69% of those earning under 10,000 have access, whereas 99% of adults of households earning over 40,000 have access. So that's clearly that economic divide. What are some of the next steps that you are recommending and seeing in terms of improving affordability and really addressing that digital divide across income levels to ensure that equitable access?
Yeah, I think we've identified several options for Scottish Government and public bodies to address some of these affordability issues. The SCVO digital roadmap that I've mentioned outlines the need for different options for people to be able to access suitable devices to meet their needs. So things like device lending libraries, public access points, if they don't have internet at home, gifting programs, and then device refurbishment projects as well are all really good ways to help people that can't afford devices or access. And then something else that we found as part of our audit is around social tariffs, which provide cheaper broadband and phone packages delivered by service providers in the same way as standard packages. But the awareness of these remains really low. So only 8% of eligible households actually take up a social tariff, which is really low. We were quite surprised. And as well as lack of awareness, I mean, some of them are still too expensive for some households. So we've recommended that the Scottish Government works with the UK Government and Ofcom and mobile and internet providers as well to promote and improve access to social tariffs. Hopefully that can make quite a big difference.
Yes, that raising awareness piece is absolutely fundamental. And the device refurbishment I read today, there are 200 million disused devices sitting in drawers in households around the UK. So if we can get some of those back out to the people that need them, that would have an incredible impact. And of course, that access to kit and the access to connectivity isn't the whole story. There's lots of factors of digital poverty, but skills is a big part of the digital divide. The report mentions 15% of Scotland's adults lack the digital foundation skills necessary to engage with these digital services. What role can and should public bodies and indeed charities play in upskilling people to really close that digital skills gap?
Yeah, I mean, we saw during the pandemic the success of programmes. The big programme in Scotland was Connecting Scotland, had such a positive impact on people's lives, and the evaluation showed that it did improve digital skills, but that additional focus and resource, we are seeing that focus has reduced since the pandemic. But as part of that, one of the things, the key to success was that close partnership working across public sector and third sectors to support vulnerable people, because we know there is a lot of resource and skills and support out there in the third sector. So it's it's not just the public sector, it's kind of it's joining up together to do that together. I think some of the other things that need to be done is sort of making sure that staff have appropriate digital skills so they're able to support and build capacity among people that need it, that are trying to access services. Accessible skills programs for service users and providers, and providing devices and support for learning in schools also plays a part. That we've highlighted in the report as well, that there needs to be a clearer strategic approach around that. We've got some, we've found some good practice during the audit, and we've got sort of a few examples in the report, particularly in case studies 1 and 3. So there's one around digital lifelines, which is providing devices, connectivity and skills and confidence training to people at risk of drug-related harm and death, and the people that support them. So, like one of the really, sort of really most excluded groups of people, but that's shown to be really successful. And then also Renfrewshire Council, which was one of our fieldwork sites, are doing a lot of good work, which again, I think David will say a bit more about some of their approaches, but they're collaborating with partners to deliver a place-based approach to digital inclusion. And this includes co-designing with citizens and developing what they call digi-zones. So that includes access to devices, internet access, but also digital skills, and getting digital champions across different settings and different parts of the area to kind of support people, and doing that in lots of different public places like libraries. So that's a really good approach that we found there as well. And yeah, we mentioned a few other approaches in other councils as well, just in lots of different ways and how you can provide support for digital skills.
And Renfrewshire always deserve a shout out because they are just amazing in what they are achieving in their area. Picking up on that point around connecting Scotland and perhaps turning to Bernadette, the programme provided really essential support during the COVID-19 pandemic. But as Gillian said, the report sort of notes that maybe some of that momentum has been slightly lost. How do you think we can regain some of that and really find that sustained approach to tackling digital exclusion effectively?
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely recognise that Connecting Scotland had a massive impact, just as Gillian said, providing that lifeline to vulnerable households during the pandemic. And it really delivered really quickly and really at scale. And obviously the pandemic was hopefully a unique time, and that was an emergency response. But the Scottish Government's not as yet reset its policy ambitions following that first phase of Connecting Scotland, and also following what has been a really significant change in the operating environment. There's been big reductions in funding available to tackle digital exclusion. So there's a real need for an effective, a relevant national digital strategy that can really set out a clear action plan for addressing digital exclusion. Now that does need leadership, and again we'd found that has weakened since the initial Connecting Scotland programme. The main players in terms of Scottish Government and COSLA, the umbrella body for councils in Scotland, they need to provide that leadership in setting out the strategy and leading the way, and we've made recommendations around that. But there is a shared responsibility across the public sector. It's all public bodies who are carrying out digital transformation. We have to be really clear that they've got a responsibility and a role to play. So it's that kind of leadership, but everyone becoming involved. And so in that sense, I think there's a lot of learning that can be taken from Connecting Scotland. That we've said that the key to success was that close partnership working across the public and third sectors, and it was just a huge collective effort. We'd every council in Scotland, 1,000 organisations all working together, and that really allowed that programme to get up running quickly and at scale. And it's also about trying and learning from different approaches. We know that evaluation of Connecting Scotland recognised that the sustainability of that delivery model and the level of investment was required would be difficult to sustain in the longer term. The new Connecting Scotland model is more based around a device lending library approach. But there's a whole mix of practice, and I think that's what Gillian has mentioned in terms of SCVO's roadmap, in terms of looking at access to affordable devices and so on. It could be a much more mixed approach, sometimes a gifting approach, sometimes a device lending approach, public access points, libraries, community centres, and device refurbishment programmes. So there is a lot of learning out there, and it's really taking advantage of that that needs to happen for and be built into the new strategy and action plan.
And it is always complex, sort of trying to take all of these different strands and really form it into something that doesn't create a one-size-fits-all system that's not going to work for everyone, but really takes account actually of those different needs and the different possibilities. You've touched there on a national digital strategy and the need for real clarity around how the ambition to leave no one behind might actually be delivered. What do you think at the leadership level, the kind of the governance, the accountability needs to happen to make sure that ambition can be achieved?
Well, we did find that in terms of the national digital strategy in Scotland, there was a lack of clear responsibilities that were set out. And for this refreshed strategy, we've obviously asked for a new detailed action plan, and that's needed. And that needs to much more clearly set out, well, who's responsible for delivering that? What are the time scales? What are the monitoring arrangements? How do we know when the plan is achieving what it's set out to do? And that means alongside that, there needs to be kind of different governance arrangements. We've also made a recommendation around that, when alongside the new strategy and plan, if there could be a kind of review and a refocusing of governance arrangements so that there is clear oversight of the progress that's being made and clear reporting. It's important that people, there's transparency, that people can see what's being invested and what's happening and whether that's working. So looking at what groups are in place, what their roles are, and how they can hold government and the wider public sector to account in addressing the issue.
And of course, it is going to take a whole coalition of people, as I think has been coming through as a core theme. But on the other hand, public bodies in Scotland, as with everywhere else, are facing increasing financial pressures. And indeed, the report sort of talks about some of the difficult choices that have to be made around public spending. Mm-hmm. How do you feel the Scottish Government and local councils can best balance these financial pressures with the need to continue investing in digital inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We're, in quite a difficult context in terms of public finances, and there's a lot of difficult decisions that Scottish Government, councils, all public bodies are having to make around their spending priorities. So it means that it's more important than ever that alongside this new strategy and plan, that there's a real setting out of, what funding is available, what can be invested in this area. And there's also a much greater need for working together, more collaborative and partnership working, to really get the best use out of the resources that are available. We did see some good examples. We talked about Renfrewshire in terms of that place-based approach and a really strong collaboration, really helping to make the best use of resources, as well as learning from each other, and also leveraging that input from the private sector and from the third sector. I think it could be quite short-sighted to not invest in digital inclusion. We recognise that digital transformation across the public sector is being pushed ahead as a way of helping public bodies to balance their books, make savings and efficiencies and so on, and better outcomes for people. And certainly in the work that we did, we came across instances of what we would call failure demand, where people are having to get support for managing debt because of a difficulty in using digital tools, public sector digital tools, and they've ended up having to seek other support and debt relief and so on because of that. So there's definitely, a lot of negative outcomes that can come about through not investing in digital inclusion. So we really see it as part of, if we want to reform public services, then digital inclusion is really an essential part of that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bernadette. And I think that takes us back around to David, really sort of picking up on this theme of collaboration, the fact that no one organisation is going to be able to solve digital poverty in any given area. The report obviously really calls for public sector, private sector, third sectors to work together on tackling digital exclusion. What do you think are some of the practical steps that organisations can be taking to really strengthen those partnerships and coordinate really effective efforts?
Yeah, I think it's linked to that last question, Elizabeth. It's really important. I think, as you've touched on, and colleagues in the team already mentioned, the report highlights opportunities that a place-based approach can offer. And we use the example of Renfrewshire and the approach with the DigiRent strategy, which I think is a really excellent example of what's possible in terms of public and private sector and third sector collaboration. So in the DigiRent example, the network of public sector and third sector organisations working together to provide resources and local support to tackle issues. Also, I think that as well as that work, it's important that, as the Renfrewshire example did, they carried out work to understand digital exclusion locally, what it means to people, how it affects their lives, and what their needs are to overcome those barriers. So it's really important that bodies work together locally to understand who's affected by digital exclusion and how it affects their lives. And I think from that basis, then you can then start to develop workable solutions that hopefully will tackle the real problems that people face. We think in the report, we commented that there are opportunities for a once for Scotland approach and learning across sectors and across bodies from each other what works. Should possibly be useful to highlight the Accounts Commission's report from 2021 that we published on digital progress in local government, where that recommended that more work needed to be done on developing and delivering common systems and platforms. There's a variation in digital interfaces for different public bodies, and that's one of the difficulties that people face when they're trying to access and use digital online services. So an area that collaboration could be used to address. But as we've said already, we do recognise there's a difficult public finance context that people are working in. And working together because of that is even more important, we think, to get the best use out of the resources that are available. So the plans to refresh the joint national digital strategy, we think, provide an opportunity for COSLA and Scottish Government to consider policy ambitions and develop clear, workable plans for that current context.
I'm picking up there. I mean, the place-based approaches have come up today a few times, and of course, this is incredibly important. If you're not digitally connected, you're not going to hop online looking for support. You need a place that you can go to, a trusted face that you can actually talk to. How can councils really be ensuring that place-based approaches, or indeed any other tailored approaches, are effective in really addressing the specific local barriers to digital inclusion within their communities?
Yeah, important question. And again, I think it's linked to the previous areas we've talked about. So I think it's important that we highlight there is a specific recommendation around that in the report, where we're recommending that councils work with partners to develop a clear approach to tackling digital exclusion as part of their strategies and plans. And that needs to be based on understanding of digital exclusion locally, who is affected and how. And we think they should map out local resources and assets across public, private and third sectors. And that also needs to provide clear routes to digital support and accessible information on the support available to people locally. So it's really about understanding the extent and the nature of the issues that affect people first, and building responses that directly address those issues. I think it's really important, as we've said, that councils work with local communities and partners to build that understanding, but also to collaborate on those solutions and actions so they can address people's needs together. I think it's also about recognising that people's needs and situations don't stand still. So learning from what works and what needs to change in collaboration between partners really needs to be an ongoing process for it to work.
And I feel like that really links into one of the report's other recommendations, which is making sure that digital inclusion is built in to service design and reform, making sure that people's needs are actually at the centre of how these services are designed and created. And what do you feel that public bodies can be doing more to ensure that digital inclusion considerations and indeed the voices of those digitally excluded individuals and their lived experience are consistently being incorporated into the service design processes used?
Yeah, I think probably at the risk of repeating myself a little bit, certainly there's a consistent message in the report hopefully people will see coming through. One of our key messages is about making sure there's an understanding of the full range of people's needs, addressing those through how services are designed, and then coordinating efforts across different public and third sector bodies to ensure that the services that are provided are effective in meeting people's needs and that they're accessible to them. And we certainly do discuss in the report the importance of designing digitally inclusive services and how that needs to start with understanding people's needs. We know that sometimes service design can be dictated by organisational considerations, or digital services are sometimes created through simply taking an offline service and building a web access approach around it at the front, for example. But there needs to be much more widespread and consistent understanding and use of different design tools that help public bodies understand and put service users' needs at the heart of service design decisions. And we talk a bit about the report about some of those tools. For example, there's a Scottish approach to service design that the Scottish Government developed. There's a digital service standard for Scotland. And also, as well as making use of those, public bodies really need to be consistently using equalities impact assessments and making sure, as we say, that people's needs and understanding of people's needs are put at the core of how services are designed around them. And the process really needs to start with that understanding.
That's excellent, David. And I think some key messages can never be repeated too frequently. So thank you. And turning back to Gillian, I mean, based on the report's findings, that rural-urban digital divide is incredibly important that we actually see that tackled and we have equitable connectivity, whilst we also balance that with really ensuring that local communities, local people, their voices and experiences are being heard. How do we address some of that rural versus urban divide?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, rural communities are particularly affected by poor connectivity, which can exclude them. We say in the report that residents in rural Scotland have 79% coverage of superfast broadband compared to 99% for those in urban areas. Quite a contrast. We didn't look at detail at the Scottish Government's programme for increasing access to superfast broadband, as part of this audit. It's something we have looked at before. But the Scottish Government's focus on increasing broadband and mobile connectivity across Scotland will make an important contribution for rural areas. It is an ongoing programme, so hopefully, we will see improvements there. But I mean, this alone isn't going to help people on lower incomes and benefits and those that can't afford access to the internet. So there still needs to be more done to improve affordability, as mentioned earlier, and then along with other non-digital and assisted digital options as well. There can't just be one way of accessing services. And I think, as we've already said, but you will have seen examples of services improving access through local libraries, community centres in rural areas as well. So again, it's that thing about looking for lots of different solutions. As you say, not one size is going to fit all, and comes back again to services just understand the needs of their own communities and how they build that into design of any new digital service.
No, perfect. And of course, coming back to you, David, as well, public services do increasingly rely on digital platforms, but your report does note that many people actually still need those non-digital options. And of course, people in rural areas will potentially be a part of that, but also lots of different communities across the whole of Scotland. How can public bodies ensure in a sustainable way that people who are digitally excluded can still access those essential services?
Yeah, I think it's related to those earlier points about starting from the basis of understanding local community needs and working with partners to ensure that that's a comprehensive understanding, and then building approaches and strategies to directly address what's needed locally in terms of service accessibility for digital and non-digital routes. And in the report, we do highlight some examples of positive practice that different bodies have taken to support access to services. So there's an example of Perth and Ross Council, where they created a directory of digital support services to help people learn more and find out what digital support is available to them to access services they need. Also, the example of Argyll and Bute Council, where they offer assisted digital support to help people access their services. And they also provide local hubs for people to go to and get access to services digitally and also by phone or face-to-face. We also heard when we spoke to Argyll and Bute Council about their work to develop their new customer engagement strategy. And that directly involved local communities and partners with an aim of providing digital services access to those who want that option or can use it, but it also retains other ways, non-digital ways to access services for people who can't use those routes or don't want to. And approaches like that can free up staff and resources to meet the needs of non-digital service users. But as we've said, the key is to first understand the needs of people who use your services and then build service delivery with those needs at the heart of the decisions you make.
It really does always come back to really understanding the people who are going to be benefiting from whatever service it is that you're running and creating. Bernadette, just to come back to you, so the report really does stress this need for the Scottish Government to refresh the digital strategy and develop this really clear action plan for reducing digital exclusion. Just to close us out on this conversation, how can this strategy be designed to really provide tangible and lasting benefits to those who are currently at risk of digital exclusion?
So within the report, we've mentioned that we set out principles for digital inclusion, and those are kind of important, touch points for the government to consider. Included in that is about having a clear plan. We've talked about that, but also about putting people at the centre, and that's a really strong theme in the work that we've done, and we found it really invaluable in the way we carried out our own audit. Working collaboratively, obviously, again, really strong, and it's about addressing all the multiple elements of digital exclusion, those elements of affordability in terms of devices and data, about skills, but not just skills, about motivation and confidence, and about good digital service design as well, that the public services are creating digital services that are easy and that for people to use. We've also said that there's a lot of resources out there already. This is not starting from scratch that the Scottish Government can use. There's a lot of work being carried out to understand the barriers. And in terms of policy and practice around digital exclusion. It's what, 10 years old, longer, certainly in terms of the Scottish Government's policy. It's been on the policy agenda for around 10 years, but there's wider practice, all the work that obviously Digital Poverty Alliance does as well. So there's a lot to build on, and a lot of recent work as well. We mentioned SAVO's digital roadmap there. So yeah, I think it's really about taking those principles, but also taking all the learning that's taken place over, you know, and practice that's been there for a long time.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for telling us more about this report. If you are interested in reading the report, and you should be, please do look on the Audit Scotland website for the Tackling Digital Exclusion report, or you can find it on Google, and do download a copy and take a little browse through. We hope that you've enjoyed today's webinar. Do keep an eye out. Do sign up for our newsletter at digitalpovertyalliance.org. That is the best way of finding out when our events are taking place, whether those are online or indeed in person. There's also a few things, if you're feeling inspired today, that some actions that you can take. So again, digitalpovertyalliance.org, you can find our charter for digital inclusion and find 5 simple steps that you can take to ensure that your organisation is really pushing forward on digital inclusion. And you can also read our national delivery plan, which sets out some clear phased actions across 6 missions that you can think about whether perhaps your organisation could play a part in that. Do also remember you can spread the word about our delivery programmes as well. If you happen to be watching this from Scotland, we have Tech for Families in Ayrshire, which is giving 4 to 16-year-olds access to laptops and connectivity. And we have a range of programmes running across every single one of the home nations in the UK. And please also remember, we can only do what we do thanks to the support and generosity of others. So if you have one of those 200 million X devices that you'd like to see in the hands of a child who needs them, or indeed you'd like to partner in a different way, do contact us. I'd just like to give our panellists the opportunity to close off with a final thought, a final takeaway for our audience today. So I'm going to put Gillian on the spot, and then Bernadette, and then David on that closing 30-second thought.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, no, it's been great to be able to talk about this a bit more with you, and really great to hear about your work as well. I think it's just a really good opportunity just again to emphasise the principles for enabling digital inclusion. As you say, it is a complex area, but actually there are quite a lot of simple steps that people can do, and if they don't know, kind of where to start, it kind of really clearly sets out why it's important. If people are in any doubt about why, I think there's really clear arguments. I think hopefully we've made those today, how people can enable digital inclusion, and then what needs to be put in place. And as we've mentioned, we've got that checklist that really breaks that down, gives you really clear questions to kind of assess yourself, and then links to examples. So just would urge people to take a look at those.
Fantastic. Bernadette?
Yeah, and just to say that, considering digital inclusion is such an important part of public sector reform, most public bodies out there will have programmes of reform or thinking about how they're changing their delivery for the 21st century, but it's really, really important that you build in digital inclusion considerations within those programmes.
David?
Yeah, I'd probably just reiterate what my colleagues already said, and I think that we're definitely not saying in the report that digital is a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination, and we've highlighted lots of positive impacts that digital technology can have on public service delivery and people's experiences of it. But it's really important that when services move online, it's done so in a focused way that really targets people's needs and understands people's needs. And I think that's the crucial message I would leave today. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for your time. Gillian, Bernadette and David, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.